depression, anxiety, ADHD, and other conditions. Please give him a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you. Before I get started, I just want to say one thing about your talk, Michelle. The spot where you said, I am not a developer. Developer is just someone who solves problems with code. And even if you're going to stretch the definition a little bit further, anyone who ends their slide with like 15 libraries, including scikit-learn, is definitely a developer. So thanks for that. And then just to piggyback off something that Michelle just said, I just also want to thank you, Saran. This has just been, I mean, this is what, yeah. This has got to be the most diverse and most engaging lineup of technical storytellers I've ever seen. And we're putting together our conference at Twilio for next month. And I can tell you that recruiting and corralling this many speakers is really hard. And she's just done it awesome. It's been an amazing experience being a speaker. So thank you for that. And thanks for having me here. My name is Greg. I serve on the developer community team at Twilio. Twilio is a communications company. We have some APIs we're best well known for. Our APIs, we sell programmable phone numbers so you can send and receive text messages, place and receive phone calls from your apps. Not going to talk about any of that today. What I want to talk about is, I think that another thing that's been really amazing about the talks today is just how much vulnerability we've already heard, right? Like Stephanie opened up this morning, and I think the second sentence in her talk was, and then it was a really bad time, and I got really depressed. I was like, oh, this is awesome. Like, this is gonna be, and then Jessica gives this talk 2 talks later about failure, right? And if you haven't been to a lot of technical conferences, this is not necessarily common to see this level of vulnerability. And depression and mental health is something that, or mental illness is just something that runs rampant in the developer community. And so many of our peers and our friends and our colleagues are suffering silently, and they feel like they're so alone. And they don't realize that they're surrounded by all these other folks that are going through the same stuff. And so what I want to do is just kind of share my story. I'm a developer, and I have bipolar disorder. And then I want to talk a little bit about how mental illness affects our community. And then I want to share some resources and offer some suggestions on what you can do if you feel like you might be suffering from these, or you might have a friend or a colleague who can. Sound good? All right, so I think depression really started kicking in for me my last year of college. It was my 5th year, the victory lap, they like to call it. But it wasn't particularly victorious for me. I had just broken up with a girlfriend. I had moved into an apartment by myself. All my friends had graduated, so I was pretty much alone on campus. I was on the verge of failing out of school. And life just felt like really bleak. And when I get depressed, I tend to sleep a lot. Like it's the most obvious symptom. And so I was sleeping at the time like 12, 16 hours a day. And really like the best part of my day was when I was unconscious. And I stopped going to class, and I stopped going to work. And like I said, most of my friends were gone, and I just wanted to hide. No one really knew what was going on. But I had one friend, his name was Bill. And Bill and I worked together. He noticed that I hadn't been to class for a while, or hadn't been to work in a while. Sent me a couple emails, just checking in. I ignored him because I didn't know how to tell him. And then one day, it's like a Tuesday, and I'm still in bed at like 2 o'clock. And Bill calls, and I see it's him, and I ignore the call. And he calls again, and I ignore the call. And the problem with Bill is he's like really persistent. Because a couple minutes later, I hear a knock on my door. And when you're forgetful like I am, there's certain life maintenance tasks that you just kind of like accept aren't going to happen. And back then, locking my doors was one of them. And so when the doorknob started to turn, I panicked. And at the time, I was sleeping on like one of those cheap mattresses. It was on one of those metal bed frames that has the casters on it. It was on a hardwood floor, so it rolled. It rolled like a foot or 2 away from the wall. And so I like very, very quietly slide into that gap. And I just pull the covers over my head. And Bill comes into my apartment, and he looks into my room, and looks in my office, and then he leaves. And that's what shame feels like, right? Like I just wanted to hide from everyone. And I get to this, I end up failing out. I lie to my parents. I didn't know how to tell them, so I tell them I graduate. And I basically spent like the next 2 or 3 years just kind of bouncing from, job to job, like starting a job, starting off really strong, and then just getting really frustrated and like dropping the ball at every chance I got and quitting before I got fired. And there's this verse in the Bible. It says, I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I don't do, but that which I hate, I do. And I just hated what I was doing. I had a friend, he would say, Greg's one of the smartest people I know, but he's also the laziest person I know. And I believed that shit because I didn't have any other excuse for it, right? Like, I just slept all day. I didn't do the work. And so finally, after like several years of just struggling with this, I went to that place that you go when you have questions about life that seem to have no answers, and I Googled it. I Googled chronic procrastination, and I start reading about ADD, and I finally, after a year, like get past the denial, I go see a therapist, and therapist, she goes, you definitely have ADD, like you're off the charts, and I'm like, yes. Because it's a reason, right? Like it's something other than being a lazy bastard. But she goes, but I think you might also have type 2 bipolar. And I was like, no. No, I'll take the ADD. And you can keep the bipolar. Because that's what crazy people have. And I didn't know anything about it at the time. So bipolar, it's also called manic depression. You cycle through periods of mania and depression. The highs are great. Like a lot of people who have bipolar don't want to get treatment because they don't want to give that up. Like when I was getting the diagnosis and she's describing it, she's like, this is mania. And I was like, yes. How do I get that all the time? But then like the lows, and type 2 bipolar, the highs aren't as high, the lows aren't as low, and the cycles are a little more elongated. So, I'd have times when I get really creative, be really, really productive for a few days, and then I just have weeks when, life just felt like walking through Jello, or it's just like all I could do just like show up to work, sometime before noon and like dress myself and feed myself. And after several years of like fighting that denial, I finally just realized that I think I'd made this deal with myself, like I don't know how to fix this, so I'm just gonna isolate and contain the damage to myself. And I finally had to realize after like job after job of letting people down, letting friends down, and worrying my parents that like you don't go through this alone, right? Like if you're suffering from mental illness, your friends and your family members are suffering too with you. And so finally I set up an appointment with a psychiatrist. And I go see him, I tell him my story, and he goes, yeah, type 2 bipolar, like, sounds exactly like what you got. You're fortunate, like we have really good meds for this, stuff called Lamictal. They tend to help, they have no side effects. Well, actually, no, I guess there is this one side effect. Very few people will end up getting this life-threatening rash inside their anus. And I go, well, I'm pretty sure if I get a life-threatening rash inside my anus, I'm still going to be depressed. But it didn't happen, not yet. It's been 8 years. And, every time I get an itch, though, I'm like, so I am incredibly fortunate. Like the meds worked the first time. That's pretty rare to get on the right stuff the first time. I had really supportive parents. I had a job. They didn't fire me. I had health insurance. I met my wife right around the same time, and she came alongside and just helped pull me out. Most people who have what I have, most people who struggle with mental illness, they're not nearly as fortunate, right? Like it's, we just heard Michelle said 5% of the population will deal with depression. In the case of bipolar, something like 10 to 20% of people who have it will die from it, in part because 1 out of 3 will attempt suicide at some point. Like it actually has a higher mortality rate than some forms of cancer. So it kind of begs the question of like, why am I here? How is this particularly relevant for this group? do an experiment. If you're comfortable, how many of you here have struggled with depression or anxiety or some sort of mental illness? Yeah. Thanks for sharing. I have this theory that's like totally unsubstantiated by science. Let me spout off some, these are like cherry-picked symptoms of bipolar and ADD, okay? Which I also have ADD. So like hyper-focusing, which y'all probably all know what that is. All right, so pressured speech, it's what it sounds like. Racing thoughts, you're just thinking really fast. Social anxiety, social isolation, irregular sleep patterns, especially onset insomnia. It's hard to fall asleep at night. It's difficult to wake up in the morning. Thoughts of grandiosity, you know. If you were a young adult or an adolescent, you're struggling with some of these things, and you're like bouncing around trying out different professions or different fields, finding software development probably feels a lot like coming home to you, you know? Like, we will accept the socially isolated. We will tolerate inconsistent bursts of productivity and irregular sleep patterns, right? And like thoughts of grandiosity are pretty much a requirement to do this job. Like, you know, like, I mean, and if you like think you can change the world and you want to change the world, I would argue that there's no skill set that you could have to better serve that goal than software development today, right? And in fact, there's this Apple commercial that says, "Here's to the crazy ones," because while everyone else sees crazy, we see genius, because the people who are crazy enough to believe the world are the ones who do. Right? So, but even though we had all these folks raise your hand, right? Like even though folks are struggling through this stuff and surrounded by people who are going through the same thing, they still suffer alone, right? Like we have a lot of great treatment for mental illness. We don't necessarily have a cure, but we have great treatments. But too many folks aren't getting to those treatments because of the stigma, right? But there's a cure for the stigma, and it's just to talk about it. Like that's it, that's how you get rid of stigma. Like you just talk about it. Talk about it and talk about it. You make the conversation so common that it's not abnormal anymore. You know, if I stood up here and I told you that I took insulin for diabetes or meds for high blood pressure, right? No one says, aren't you afraid you're gonna be dependent on that for the rest of your life? No one would say, aren't you afraid maybe you're using that as a crutch? In fact, actually, like even that phrase, right? Like using it as a crutch. And Katrina, I saw you're on crutches. Crutches are actually pretty useful, right? Right? Like, no one's going up to Katrina and it's like, hey, like I saw you hurt your foot, but aren't you afraid you're using that padded pole as a crutch? And I guarantee it's like way harder for her to come out and live her life. Like it'd be way easier just like go sit on the couch, right? Than to like use something to help her go on about her life. And some folks, you know, will for some folks, crutches is a temporary thing to get them out of a situation, to help their body heal, you know. Some folks will be on crutches the rest of their life, but that's fine, right? But we talk about conditions of the brain different than we talk about anything that happens below the neck. And I think the best possible thing we can do to erase that, to help folks get the help they need, is just to change the conversation, change the way we talk about this. So if some of this sounds a little bit too familiar to you, there's just a list of resources here, just a half a dozen. If you just text this number, you'll get a link back. And there's some resources on there specifically around mental health and tech. There's a couple great communities that are online. There's some articles on there you can check out. Also, if you're going through this, I think the best possible thing you could do is to talk to a professional, right? And I know there's a lot of stigma around seeing a therapist, right? Like it's like this admission of like weakness, or like admitting you're broken. First off, like I am weak, like I am broken and need help, right? But even if you don't necessarily want to buy that, like Michael Jordan, greatest basketball player of all time, he had a coach, right? Like a therapist is an objective third party who has spent a decade in school, spends all day working with folks going through stuff that you're going through, and just sit there and help you get better, to help you figure out how you're living your life, help point you in the direction of resources. They're incredibly useful. And it can be a pain in the ass to set up that first appointment. ZocDoc.com has worked well for me. You can set the whole thing online. You can find someone who works with your insurance close by. It's made that process a lot easier over the last few years. If you're not ready to see a therapist, talk to someone. If you text this number, I'll also just forward to my phone. And if you don't have a friend, if you didn't see someone you know with their hand raised, and you want to chat with, just hit me up. Always happy to talk about this stuff. There's also some great, like I said, communities online where you can chat anonymously about these things with fellow developers too. More than anything, I would just like to encourage you, if you're in the midst of it right now, and if life just feels really hard and it seems like things are never going to get better, just know that 13 years ago, when I'm in college, I'm in bed, I had nights when I was praying that God wouldn't wake me up, right? I could not imagine a future in which things got better. And today I'm I feel really fortunate to live in this great city. I have a 2.5-year-old daughter who's just amazing, and I never could have foreseen this. And by definition, if you're suffering from mental illness, your brain is lying to you, right? It's taking in data, it's running it through a faulty analysis process, and it's giving you wrong conclusions. So if you're in the midst of this, just know that when your brain's telling you, hey, it will never get better. Hey, don't share this because they will shun you. They will not want to talk to you. They'll ostracize you. Your brain is lying to you. I just want to encourage you that it really, truly can get better. And the first step down that road is to talk about it. Thank you all very much.
Thanks. That was amazing. Please give it all a round of applause.